Angelicus and Sperb.
Welcome. Today is our 20th episode of Sperb Herbs. Thank you guys very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. We have an exciting herb today. Today we're going to be talking about Huang Lian, Coptis rhizoma, also known in English as Coptis rhizome. As always, I am your presenter, Dr. Greg Sperber. And without hesitation, why don't we get into it? So if you are an acupuncturist, this podcast, as well as others, are approved for a California Acupuncture Board continuing education units and National Certification Commission for Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine professional development activities at a reasonable cost. Please check us out at www.integrativemedicinecouncil.org. That's the website, Integrative Medicine Council, COUNCIL.org, and you can get all your CUs taken care of. I have also written a couple of books, Integrative Pharmacology, combining modern pharmacology with integrative medicine, and Playing the Game, a step-by-step guide to accepting insurance as an acupuncturist. Both of these are available at the shop on www.spurbsherbs.com, which you can get all sorts of information, see all of our podcasts and all that at spurbsherbs.com. That's SPERBSHERBS.com. So today we actually have kind of a good long podcast, so we have a little bit shorter something different, and it's not going to be super something different. It's an interesting one. I'm kind of excited about it. It's about the three yellows. We're going to be talking about the three yellows today, and that's because our herb for today, Huang Lian, is one of the three herbs known as the three yellows, or in Chinese it's known as San Huang. Besides Huang Lian, Coptis rhizoma, these three include Huang Qin, Scutellaria radix, and Huang Bai, Philodendron cortex. All three herbs are in the clear, damp, heat category of herbs and are bitter and cold. They are often used together both internally and externally to treat heat toxins with dampness. This combination is a very good dermatological herb as well as an internal herb. While there is a Chinese herbal formula with just these three herbs, the more commonly used formula, Coptis decoction to resolve toxicity, Huang Lian Jedu Tong. I often say Huang Lian Jedu San, which means powder, as opposed to Tong, which is decoction. Adds Gardenia fructis Jerdza to these three yellows. And this formula is quote unquote the standard formula to clear heat and resolve toxicity in Chinese medicine. And that may sound a little esoteric for those not in Chinese medicine, but when we say clear heat, resolve toxicity, we're often, not always, but often talking about infections. And so these are very good for infections of all sorts. These three herbs work so well together because Huang Qin addresses issues in the upper burner, especially in the lungs. So, I've referred to the three burners several times in these podcasts. I still haven't done a deep dive into the three burners, but this is a special organ in Chinese medicine, and it's broken. It's called the three burners. So, Huang Qin addresses issues in the upper burner, especially the lungs. Huang Lian addresses the middle burner, and Huang Bai addresses the lower burner in kidney and bladder issues. So, all three burners are hit with this combination of herbs. Together, they're very effective for draining damp heat from all three burners, which basically means the whole body. Outside of the three burners, we're talking the limbs, basically, and the head. They are also quite antimicrobial and have been found effective in bacterial, viral, and parasite infections. And one of the unique things about it is they do not seem to engender antibiotic resistance. So they're really good for that. Now, the antibiotic resistance may be because they're not used frequently in any given individual, but if it, for some reason, does avoid antibiotic resistance, this could be a really powerful tool, and I've found it to be a very powerful tool in my clinical practice. Sometimes a fourth yellow is added, Da Huang, which is translated as big yellow Da Huang, as big yellow, so Da means big and Huang means yellow. And this one is Ray radix et rhizoma, or rhubarb root is what this herb is. And this is a purgative herb that is also bitter and cold and has similar functions as the three yellows. It's a little bit stronger than the three yellows, any of the individual the three yellows, and adds a big punch to any formula that it includes. And I love one of the quotes on Rhizoma Ray, and I'm sure we're going to have a podcast, Sperb Herbs, on it soon. But what it's as the general that kicks in the door and unclogs anything that needs to be that is clogged. So, or accumulated, that's a more technical term. So it's a really useful herb, but it's a strong herb. And so combined with these other three becomes a very strong combination in the four yellows. So there we go. And with that as a little bit of an introduction, let's get into today's herb, which is Huang Lian. And we're going to start with an herbal legend. I think I've said before, I have a great little book that's called the 50 Herbal Legends. So only about 50 herbs out of 300, so not all of them are included in this, but these are 50 strong, really important herbs. And there's all these herbal legends around it. It's really cute. It's from China. It's a translation out of the Chinese. And so when I can, I always like to include the herbal legend. So here is the herbal legend of Huang Lian. A long time ago, in the mountain of Baomount, lived renowned Dr. Dao, who had a beautiful garden where he grew hundreds of medicinal herbs. One day, Dr. Dao left town to see patients. Before leaving, he hired a helper, Mr. Huang, to take care of his garden. It was a freezing morning in January. Along the road to the garden, Mr. Huang found lots of little wild plants with beautiful greenish white flowers. They were so beautiful, especially in cold wintertime, that Mr. Huang could not help moving those pretty little things into the garden. Dr. Dao had a lovely daughter whose name was Mei Juan. One day she suddenly fell ill. She felt a sensation of dry heat. She also had symptoms of vomiting and diarrhea. 3 days later, she was in a coma. Several doctors came to cure her disease, but left without result. The worst sign was blood in Mei Juan's stool. She was almost at death's door, and no one knew how to save her. By chance, Mr. Huang remembered those pretty flowers, and he thought that maybe those wild plants could help. Immediately, he rushed to the garden, dug up some of those plants and their roots, washed and boiled them with water. Then he had Mei Juan drink the boiled water. A few hours later, Mei Juan felt much better. After drinking it twice more, Mei Juan unexpectedly recovered. When Dr. Dao returned home, he asked about his daughter's symptoms and then knew that her disease was the accumulation of heat in the intestine and stomach. The method to cure it was to clear away heat and toxin. Therefore, he knew that those plants must have those actions. After many clinical trials, Dr. Dao concluded that this kind of plant was the medicinal herb for clearing away heat and toxins. Because the helper's name was Huang Lian, Dr. Dao named the herb Huang Lian to commemorate him. Since then, Huang Lian has joined the big family of medicinal herbs. For Mei Juan, Mr. Huang was the real hero who saved her life. Doubtless, she married Mr. Huang shortly after the incident. So that's a nice little story. It's to the point. It's not one of the more exciting ones, but it's to the point. It's cute. All right, so let's get into some of the specifics about Huang Lian today. Its family is Ranunculaceae. Nope, excuse me. Let me try that again. Ranunculaceae is the family for Coptis, and we've seen this before. We're going to see that in just a minute. And there's a lot of really good medicinal herbs that come out of this family. The specific species for Huang Lian is Coptis chinensis franche, and other species that are sometimes associated with this is Coptis deltoidea, CY Chung and Shao. Those are the discoverers. That's what those names come in. And this in Chinese is Sanjiao Ye Huang Lian. And another one associated with Huang Lian is Coptis tita wall, which is in Chinese Yun Lian. Its medicinal part is the rhizome, which is a rootlet, basically. English translation of Huang Lian is yellow link or connection. So a connection, which makes sense. It affects the middle burr, which is the connection between the upper and the lower. So that makes sense. Other names for Huang Lian include gold thread or Chinese gold thread, even Japanese gold thread sometimes. Anemone grown landica. This is a Latinate binomial, so that's probably an incorrect species name, but it's along these lines. Kenka root, yellow root. In Japanese, it's orin. In Korean, it's Huang Lian. Again, I should always say that my Chinese is not very good, but I keep trying. I've had several years. My Japanese and Korean are non-existent, so I apologize for any of my pronunciations. And other Chinese names for this is Chuan Lian, Ya Lian, Wei Lian, Ji Zhua Lian, and Wang Lian. Now, sometimes these are synonyms, and sometimes they mean something specific, like it comes from a specific area, or it might be of higher or lower quality. So Bensky, remember we look at three major books when we're comparing these herbs. Bensky and his team, Chen and Chen, and Brand and Wiseman. Those are the three teams of authors for these three books. And they disagree with each other, which I love because that gives us a lot of information about the herbs. So Bensky and his team says the dosage is 1.5 to 9 grams. Chen and Chen says it's 2 to 10 grams per day. And Brand and Wiseman is 1.5 to 10 grams. So they're all right in the ballpark. There's no super discrepancies here. I mean, discrepancy between 1.5 and 2 grams on the low end and 9 and 10 grams on the high end is not a big discrepancy. So let's talk about that Ranunculaceae family again. We already discussed this family in regards to Baitoang pulsatilla in episode 16. So that was just a few episodes ago. There are 43 genera and 2,000 known species in this family of buttercups or crowsfoot's flowering plants. So these are flowering plants, often known as buttercups or crowfoots. It translates, the Ranunculaceae translates from the Latin as little frog, which is interesting. They are mostly herbaceous annuals or perennials, but there are some woody climbers and shrubs. The flowers are bisexual, and several genera in this family are important in Chinese herbology and other traditions, including aconite, Cimicifuga, and clematis. And we haven't even talked about the pulsatilla, which I just mentioned. And here's Coptis. So there's a lot of really important herbs that come out of this family. All right, so that's a good introduction to the family. So the categories, very, very similar, but these are translations. Usually they use the same book as a source, so I'm always curious about the translations. But so they're similar. Bensky says it is an herb that clears heat and dries dampness. Chen states it's a heat-clearing and dampness-drying herb. And Brand and Wiseman similarly classifies it as a heat-clearing, dampness-drying, medicinal. Some of the hyphens are a little bit different in these things, but basically they're all saying the same thing. It clears heat and it dries, drains dampness. All agree it is bitter and cold and enters the heart, large intestine, liver, and stomach organs. So a wide variety of organs. Both Bensky and Chen both agree that the original source of this herb is the Shendong Ben Sao Jing, the Divine Husbandman's classic of the Materia Medica that was written in the 2nd century CE. So that is significant because that is the first, at least existing book on individual herbs. So if an herb is included in that book, it means it's been around as long as any other herb, basically. So this is one of the first herbs. So Huang Lian quality, according to Bensky, good quality consists of big complexes of rhizomes and roots with long rhizome parts with no or only short or smooth internodes and no hairy roots or scaly leaves. The surface should be yellow or yellowish brown, the cross-section golden yellow, and the taste extremely bitter. This is a very bitter herb. When I use this or any of the three yellows, it can stain yellow and it's going to be very bitter in taste. Zhao and Chen, which is a book on quality of herbs, says superior grade is thick, strong, and firm with a reddish yellow fractured surface, no remnants of stems and hairy rootlets. In addition, they continue to say that high quality does not have the characteristic of crossing the bridge. This guo qiao in Chinese means a long, thin portion of the rhizome that is found between nodes, like a bridge crossing the two sides. I have a picture of this. I'm still not sure I picture exactly what they're talking about in their book. It's a beautiful book. To help determine Coptis chinensis from other similar species, it should gather in a cluster, be shaped like a chicken's claw, be 3 to 6 centimeters in length, and a diameter of 0.3 to 0.8 centimeters. So again, that's all from this book on quality of herbs by Zhao and Chen. So what are its Chinese medical actions? According to Bensky and his team, Huang Lian has several Chinese medical actions. Clears heat and drains dampness in the stomach or intestines with diarrhea or dysentery, as well as acid regurgitation or vomiting due to stomach heat. It drains fire and resolves fire toxicity. It clears heat and stops bleeding, especially nosebleeds or blood in the stool, urine, or vomitus due to hot blood. So when blood has heat in it, we say it becomes reckless and can exit the vessels. And so we see things like this and often bruising, but that's not necessarily for this herb. This herb doesn't necessarily treat that. It's more for blood in the nose, in the stool, in the urine, or in vomitus, if someone vomits. Clears heat topically for red and painful eyes in tongue and mouth ulcers. And as I said, I will often use it in dermatological formulas on other parts of the body. Chen and Chen has very similar actions. Clears heat and dries dampness, especially in the stomach and intestines. Sounds exactly the same. Sedates fire, especially liver and heart fire. So that's interesting. And I find it interesting, we've talked about the stomach and intestines, which are part of the middle burner. Remember we said Huang Lian is a middle burner herb. The liver is also part of the middle burner, so it makes sense that it affects the liver. The heart is more about the upper burner, so it's a little bit different here, but it's useful because it actually gets into some 5-element correspondences. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but that's part of the reason why it affects the heart as well, so it's very good. And then finally, Chen Chen says it clears fire toxin, especially dermatological disorders. So again, I really like it for dermatological disorders. Brown and Wiseman have their own actions and sub-actions. They say it clears heat and dries dampness. So again, we're seeing that in the stomach and intestines. So again, that's across the board. They all agree that it does that. And it also drains fire and resolves toxins. So nothing super major, maybe some slight differences in the terminology or the translations, but very similar. So Huang has some interesting thoughts about Huang Lian. Now, remember, Huang he wrote the 10 key formula families, and Coptis is one of those 10 key formula families. So he has a lot to say about Huang Lian, though not as much as some of the other herbs in that book. And so it's always interesting to get his perspective on this. And he says it's an herb with an extensive scope of use. It is used to clear fire and heat in the following conditions: heart fire, stomach fire, liver fire, damp heat, and heat toxins. So these are all very technical Chinese terms. And I think in a more general way, what we're really talking about is infections. In a lot of is not the only way you can get these conditions, but often is a way that we can do it. And I think it's an easy way to kind of put it in a Western perspective. Wang continues with his thoughts, and he says a Coptis presentation has 3 aspects. And I like the way that Wang does these things. He has, for each of the 10 key formula families, he has a presentation of that herb, and this is what you expect to see in all cases, or something similar in all cases that are going to use any of the formulas in that key family. So looking at a Coptis presentation, I think, is really useful for us to understand this. And what he says is actually, he gives 3 groupings of this. The first one includes irritability and restlessness, which he actually says is the key sign or symptom. Without irritability and restlessness, you're not in the Coptis presentation. So we expect some irritability and restlessness, or palpitations, especially if it's affecting the heart, insomnia, unclear consciousness, or a subjective feeling of feverishness. So that's that heat that we're talking about. So that's number 1. Number 2 is digestive tract symptoms such as epigastric focal distension, stomach ache, abdominal pain, diarrhea, or nausea and vomiting. And that is really one of the things that Coptis excels at is abdominal and stomach and small intestine issues. And finally, number 3, we expect to see a red or dark red tongue body that is tough and firm with a greasy, thick or thin yellow coat and a somewhat dry tongue surface. So when we see all 3 of these signs, we know we're looking at Coptis and one of the formulas that has Coptis in it. And it gives us a good idea of what kind of to expect when we see this herb being used. And finally, for Chinese medical actions, it is in the Divine Farmers Materia Medica, the Shendong Ben Sao Jing, and it says some interesting stuff. Now remember, this is the first existing, so often there's a little bit of spiritual spirits and a little bit of Chinese magic involved with some of these herbal things. It is considered a superior class herb, which means that it can be taken with some frequency and that it is not overall incredibly harmful, though I think we're going to have a little bit of a question later on about that. But the Shendong Ben Sao Jing says Huang Lian is bitter, non-toxic, and mainly treats heat, qi, eye pain, injured canthi, those are the edges of the eyes, and tearing. So this is, what I hear a lot is this is going to the eye. It's a big eye. In fact, the next point is it brightens the eyes and treats intestinal vacuation. In other words, everything is going out of the intestine, so lots of diarrhea. Abdominal pain, dysentery, and female genital swelling and pain. And protracted taking may improve memory. So I think in modern times we do not recommend protracted taking of this herb. It can cause lots of issues because it's very bitter, very cold. We'll talk about some of those concerns in a few minutes. So there we go. And I can't, for me, in my knowledge, I can't figure out why it might improve memory along the way. So, but that's originally what it was said to help with. So Western uses of this herb are hard to come by. This herb is used almost exclusively as a Chinese herb. WebMD has several uses for this herb that look similar to Chinese uses, so digestive problems, skin infection caused by Leishmania parasites, so that's a very specific skin issue. Sexually transmitted infection caused by Trichomonas vaginalis or trichomoniasis. And finally, scaly, itchy skin, such as in psoriasis. So again, several dermatological reasons for using this. The one aspect I would say when using this on skin is usually use it with at least another 1 or 2 of the 3 yellows. And altogether, it can actually stain the skin for a while until it sloughs off. So that yellow berberine, which we're going to talk about, is actually used as a dye, a yellow dye. And so it can stain for a while. Not just, of course, skin, but clothes and sheets and stuff that you might lay down after using it topically. So let's talk about some of the commentary. These are comments that are in these books. And generally, Bensky has a very thorough commentary on all the herbs, and it does in this case. And it actually discusses some interesting aspects of this herb. Its intense coldness enables it to cool heat and resolve toxicity. Its intense bitterness enables it to drain fire and dry dampness. Hence, its importance in the treatment of damp heat, constrained fire, and heat toxin. It is best at draining heart and stomach fire while clearing damp heat from the stomach and intestines. They translate a passage from Rectification of the Meaning of Materia Medica by Zhang Shan Lei. Coptis rhizoma is very bitter and very cold. Bitterness dries dampness, coldness prevails over heat. It can drain and direct downward all excessive damp fire and can treat all heat in the heart, spleen, liver, and kidneys, and all fire in the gallbladder, stomach, and large and small intestines. In the upper body, it clears eye disorders due to wind and fire. In the middle, it calms nausea and vomiting due to pathology of the liver and stomach. In the lower body, it unblocks dysenteric disorders with abdominal pain. All of this results from its drying dampness and clearing heat. In addition, Bitterness enters the heart, clearing and scouring out blood heat. So that's that heat in the blood that I was talking about earlier. Zhang continues to say that it is important for this herb to be combined with other herbs to treat these conditions. Many of these combinations will be discussed soon. We have a lot of combinations to go over. We're going to do that. Chen and Chen comment that both this herb and Swanzao Ren, Semen Sisyphe spinosae, treat insomnia. Huang Lian addresses excess fire in the heart, disturbing the Shen or spirit. So Shen is a Chinese word for spirit. And what we mean by that is sort of the spirit of a person, like a good spirit, like you have, you're spirited, that would be kind of a use for that in English. Swanzao Ren treats heart and liver vacuity with lack of nourishment in the heart and Shen. So a little bit different. So Huang Lian is excess and Swanzao Ren is vacuity, basically, is a good differentiator between these two herbs when used for insomnia. There are several different preparations for Huang Lian. Dry fried Coptis or chow Huang Lian moderates the cold ability to avoid injuring the yang qi of the stomach and spleen. Some say this preparation allows the herb to enter the blood, cooling blood heat and resolving toxicity. There's ginger Coptis, which is jiang Huang Lian. This focuses the herb's cooling action on the middle burner, where it cools stomach fire and heat, alleviating the nausea and directing the rebellious qi downward. So dry frying is exactly what it sounds like. You're frying it up fairly dry with no, in a pan with no oil or anything else. Ginger Coptis is, there's a couple things, we're going to see a couple other herbs here that may be used in the preparation of Huang Lian. And it can mean a couple different things, but definitely ginger is involved in the preparation of this jiang Huang Lian or ginger Coptis. And in general, ginger is very good for that middle burner for digestion, for warming the stomach and intestines. So it makes sense. It kind of balances out a little bit what's going on with the Huang Lian, but directs it more towards that stomach. And so that's very cool that that's used in combination. Wine fried Coptis, Jiao Huang Lian, lifts the action of this herb to the head and eyes and cools upper burner fire. So you can actually, by preparing different preparations, you can kind of direct where the herbs will go to. And wine fried, usually when we're saying wine, we're talking about sorghum or rice-based wines as opposed to our wines we would drink, our grape-based wines. And so and a little bit of that is used when frying it up as a preparation. So that's Jiao Huang Lian. We have an interesting one, Avodia Coptis or Yu Huang Lian. And this is where Avodia fructus or Wu Zhu Yu is boiled and removed. Huang Lian is added, absorbs the water, and then it's dry fried or baked. Huang Lian prepared this way focuses on clearing and resolving damp heat at the qi level. So qi level is talking about the 4 levels, and we haven't had a huge explanation of those at this point. So we're not going to get into that at this point. It's a technical sort of thing, but we'll get into it at some point. The 4 levels are certainly make it interesting, something different. It is often used, this Yu Huang Lian or Avodia Coptis is often used for damp heat, leading to diarrhea and nausea, or for liver and stomach disharmony with liver fire constraint, causing acid regurgitation, belching, or nausea. So this again is a really interesting combination because Avodia fructus Wu Zhu Yu is a very warming herb, while Coptis is a very cooling herb. So it's kind of a combination. They kind of balance each other out. But the same token, Avodia fructus Wu Zhu Yu does go to the stomach and small intestines, and so it makes sense that this is going to help direct it and really work it that way and include some liver aspects into that as well. So it's a very interesting preparation method that I haven't seen before. Saltwater fried Coptis, so this is frying the Coptis in salt water, is Yan Shui Chow Huang Lian. and it reduces its dryness and focuses its effects on the lower burner, clearing fire to protect kidney water. So usually salt water we say goes to the kidneys, so that's great. It's another way we can direct how this herb will actually function. And it also, salt water will also help retain some fluids. And so again, it reduces its dryness because of that. So it's a very interesting preparation here. And finally, we have charred Coptis or Huang Lian Tan, which guides the effects into the blood level where it clears heat, cools the blood, stops bleeding, and alleviates dysenteric disorders. And again, this is a very common preparation that we see with a lot of herbs, is charring. And we do say that whenever you char something, it enters the blood and it clears heat, stops bleeding. Stops bleeding is a major function of this, the charring process. So, and that's really, it has an explanation in the book of how you char it, but basically you cook it until it's charred is basically the short thing. I like kind of talking about these preparations because we get to see a lot of differences from the herb just based on the preparations. Are these used a lot in modern times? Sometimes if someone uses a lot of raw herbs, which I think is becoming less and less, I think most practitioners are going to prepared herbs in many different forms and also granules. And so these preparations become less important when you're selling those sort of things. However, granules, if you look hard and on some herbs, you will see some preparations that you can purchase so that the herbs are actually prepared and then made into granules. So it can be very useful to know this, and it's one of those areas where I'm interested in it because we didn't learn a ton of it when I was going through school. So I like learning about these different preparations as well. So there we go. So let's move on. Let's move on to combinations. There are a lot of basic combinations of this herb with numerous traditional functions. I already mentioned the 3 yellows. Here we'll cover several selected ones, but this is by no means a complete list. In fact, one of the comments says that you really don't use this herb alone, that you always use it in some form of combination, so we see that a lot. So here, the first one we already kind of talked about with the preparations with Avodia fructis, Wujuyu, becomes a combination of hot and cold herbs and treats heat in the liver channel, causing liver and stomach disharmony. So we often will use opposite herbs, opposite functioning herbs, and allows the body to kind of regulate between those two herbs to do what it needs to do. So I like that combination of opposites, so hot and cold herbs here. With Cinnamomum cortex rogue, which again is a hot herb, reestablishes harmonious communication between the heart and kidneys. So that's a very different sort of combination. With Aucklandia radix or Muxiang, the combination of 1 yin and 1 yang herb, 1 cold and 1 hot, 1 opening acrid flavor, that would be the Muxiang, and 1 downward directing bitter flavor, which would be the Coptis, creates a powerful heat clearing and dampness drying effect that facilitates the flow of qi to guide out obstruction. So very interesting. That sounds very powerful combination, Muxiang and Huang Lian. It is used with Anamarania rhizoma or germu, and this acts strongly to clear stomach heat and direct fire downward while concurrently drying dampness without harming the normal yin fluids. So germu is a great herb. It is a drying herb. It is a dry heat. It's a not drying herb. It's a clear heat herb. It's the opposite of drying. It actually is one of the few herbs that clears heat without drying, and it actually moistens a little bit. And so that's why it says it concurrently dries dampness without harming the normal yin fluids. So it's a very unique herb. I like the herb a lot. And it's very unique in its actions with that clearing heat, but moistening at the same time. So with Scutellaria radix, Huangqin, so this is one of those 3 yellows that we talked about, and we have a lot to talk about here because this is a very common combination. So Huangqin, remember, is the one that goes to the upper burner. So traditionally, Huang Lian acts primarily to drain fire from the heart and stomach, while Huangqin clears heat from the lungs and stomach. The combination is thus best suited for draining pathogenic heat from the upper and middle burners. It is often used for damp heat that is accumulated in the intestines. In addition, Wang Qing cools the blood in order to quiet the fetus in pregnancy, while Huang Lian clears heat to alleviate nausea. The combination is therefore useful in pregnancy when nausea occurs with heat disturbing the fetus, though it should only be used in small doses and for short periods of time. In general, in pregnancy, we don't use downward draining herbs because there are things that, you can initiate issues with the baby. So we generally don't use this. So if we are going to use this, small doses, short periods of time. In fact, one of the contraindications that we're going to talk about is don't use this during pregnancy. So even though this is a very interesting combination, it has to be used very judiciously. You want to make sure that there's heat involved. If there's no heat, a lot of harm can happen here if used in pregnancy. Other common combinations include Asari herba or Shishin, Asini kori kala or jiao. That is, we translate it as ass-hide glue, so it's glue from donkeys. So that's an animal product, so some people definitely won't use that. Babuse Collis intanium or juru, this is from the bamboo plant. Mume fructus wu mei, which is plum, is bitter or salty plum is wu mei, and that's a very good herb for the digestion. Juru, the Bambuse Collis intanium, clears heat. Jiao is really used to build blood. And then Asari herba Shishin, it's a difficult herb to get these days. It's not exactly banned, but it's not exactly free-flowing at this point. Basically due to some research saying that it had some harmful constituents, though later research said it was adulteration, that this herb actually doesn't have those constituents. But Border Patrol hasn't really, Customs hasn't really figured that out, so it's hard to get sometimes. And that is a very warming, exterior relieving herb. So good herb. All right, so let's talk about the contents of Huang Lian. The main constituent of Huang Lian is berberine, and that is an alkaloid and gives it its distinctive yellow color, as well as apparently a lot of its medicinal actions. I did say that berberine is used as a yellow dye, so that explains the yellow color and some of its other uses other than medicinal uses. There are other alkaloids in this herb, including coptisine. So again, this has the name of the herb in it, so that usually means it's fairly, they either discovered it in that herb or it's fairly contained. Not many other herbs will have the same constituent. Epiberberine, so this is similar obviously to berberine. There's a lot of these like berberubine, palmitine, clumbamine, jatorizine, warenine, magnoflorine, berberastine, and grolandicine. So those are all alkaloids. Phenolic compounds include 3,4-dihydroxyphenyl ethyl alcohol glucoside, 3-carboxy-4-hydroxyphenoxyglucoside, and ferulic acid. Quercetin is a flavonoid, which is also, when I looked at the research, quercetin is looked at a lot for medicinal uses as well. And then other compounds include lumacaruleic acid, obaquinone, and obaculactone. So those are some of the contents. Like I said, the big one is berberine, and some others are useful as well, like the quercetin, and I've seen, I think epiberberine in some of these studies as well. So let's talk a little bit about berberine. It's said to have several types of pharmacological activity, including improving the activity of the digestive system, antimicrobial activity, central nervous system effects such as being anxiolytic, so it helps anxiety, antidepressant, neuroprotective, it protects our nerves, and antinociceptive, which means that it acts on the nerves to prevent pain reception. So it actually tamps down the pain response. It's also vasorelaxant and antihypertensive, potentially. So this all came from Badal and Delgado, which is a book on pharmacognosy, and that's looking at all these chemicals and what they do. One of my, I think that's really useful and important to look at. However, often when you look at the research that they're quoting, it's animal research or bench research, which does not mean that that these things happen clinically. You see that a lot when I talk about the science of this herb as well. So we got to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. We see these effects, but we see them in rats and we see them in cells. We don't see them in the human after they take them in necessarily. I'd have to look at all the different things, but that's been my general, when I view these things, that's what I've seen. So interesting at potential activities, but I'm not sure they've been clinically proven at this point. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say they have not been clinically proven at this point. So let's talk about the science. So Chen and Chen states Huang Lian is antibiotic, antipyretic, anti-inflammatory, cholagogic, which helps bile acid formation. I should go back on. So antibiotic is obviously helping, is against bacteria. Antipyretic means it lowers fevers, which makes sense if it's a cold herb. Anti-inflammatory, often when we clear heat in Chinese medicine, we're often being anti-inflammatory. Cholagogic helps bile acid formation. That's that middle burner function. It's a perfect sort of interface between the liver and the intestines, because that's where the gallbladder is, and the bile is important, and both of those are important. Bile acid formation. Anti-ulcer, anti-diarrheal, and as a local anesthetic. So that's an interesting use of this herb that we haven't heard before. They continue to list some Chinese studies showing positive effects in treating bacterial dysentery. So I'm including with this says N greater than 1,000. So that what that means is those studies had over 1,000 subjects to it. N is the number of subjects. And generally we're looking for an N just to be able to do statistics and have any statistical ability to manipulate the numbers. We want an N of at least 30 to 40. And then the higher it goes, the better off it is. So this has an N of over 1,000. So that's a fairly good sized study. That's a pretty darn good sized study that this helps treat bacterial dysentery, which is traditionally one of its major functions. So it makes sense. It also treats acute gastroenteritis. So this is inflammation and pain in the stomach and intestines. And that had an N of 100. So smaller, much smaller, bigger than that statistical, but still kind of a smallish study. Pulmonary, it can treat pulmonary tuberculosis with an N of 100. So again, in that medium category. Can help suppurative otitis media. So this is pus coming out of middle ear infection. So that's an issue when there's no N given on that. Arrhythmias, so these are heart arrhythmias, an N of 50, so that's considered a really small study. Hypertension with an N of 88, so still kind of smallish. And osteomyelitis, again, 87 is the N, so again, kind of smallish. Osteomyelitis is inflammation and infection of the bones and muscles. That can be a very painful condition. So generally, these were kind of smallish, though potentially statistically significant Chinese clinical studies. Without looking at the studies, and most of these are in the Chinese language. I've tried to look up a lot of the studies that are in Chen and Chen's book, and have not gotten. I'll get often I'll get an abstract of it, but I won't be able to get into the actual study because it's Chinese. It's in Chinese, and I don't read Chinese that well. However, when you look at the methods, when I've been able to look at some of the methods of these, they're, depending on the age, they're a little bit questionable methods in modern day clinical studies. So I like to take a lot of these studies with a grain of salt. I do think it's cool, especially this bacterial dysentery, because that is a traditional use of this, and we're seeing some support with it from the science. I think that is very useful to see. So I did a scholarly search for review articles. I like review articles. Those are high levels of evidence discussing Huang Lian, and I found no clinical review papers at all in my search. I did find some reviews, but they were more like reviews of the effects, and then when I looked into them, it was just basically a grouping of the animal and bench studies, so I didn't consider it a clinical review in any way, shape, or form. The research isn't there, and like I said, this is almost a purely Chinese medical herb. And we find that when we see that, we see a lot of research in China, which doesn't always get translated into the US, but we don't see a lot of Western research in it. And this is supported by both the World Health Organization monograph and WebMD, which actually I think is a pretty good source of information. Not perfect, but pretty good. And both say there are no research-supported clinical uses for this herb. So, and that was my finding when I did research on this, which is disappointing, but it is what it is. Having said that, there were lots of bench research and some animal studies regarding various reported uses, but these are not clinically relevant at this time. So remember, I'm not a big fan of bench research and animal studies because just because something happens to a cell on the bench or a rat when injected does not mean that it will have any of the same effects on a human. So I do not consider those clinical studies at all. In addition, most of these studies, I found one or two maybe that had the whole herb extracts, but most of these were on berberine, or I told you about that quercetin. They were constituents of the herb rather than the herb itself, and I don't think that's incredibly clinically useful, because what you're doing basically is making a drug from the herb and then seeing if that drug has an effect. That, to me, does not translate to the herb having the same effect or not. So I'm not a huge fan of looking at the constituents and then extrapolating into the herb helps the person. But it all points in a direction which I think is useful and can point to further research. So useful for that purpose. Huang Lian, so that's it for the science. There wasn't a lot for the science. Let's get into drug-herb interactions. And again, not a ton, but we'll have a conversation. Huang Lian does appear to inhibit cytochrome P450-2D6. So we haven't had an in-depth cytochrome P450 conversation, but this is one of the targets for drug-herb interactions. It is an enzyme primarily in the liver that helps metabolize drugs, which helps them go to excretion. And there are lots of different subtypes. So this is subtype 2D6, which is like, I think, the third or fourth most common subtype. But the most common 3A4 is about 60% of drugs, and then it drops down to about 20 or 30% of the drugs. So this isn't going to be a huge drug-herb interaction issue. So some of its constituents, however, such as berberine, may also inhibit or induce, according to one rat study, cytochrome P450-3A4. So that is the most common one. So when I see 3A4 being affected, my ears perk up on drug-herb interactions. But this is all based on bench and animal research. We actually don't know if it has any effect in humans. And again, it's just berberine, or another constituent. It's not the herb. And the question is there enough berberine in the herb to actually affect cytochrome P450-3A4? We don't know the answer to that. So I'm not there to say this is an actual interaction. Again, that same study, one of the same studies that looked at 3A4 and berberine, also said it inhibits P-glycoprotein, though there was no evidence of Huang Lian as a whole herb doing so. So P-glycoprotein is a transporter protein in the cells. And again, this is very much looked at as a marker for drug-herb interactions. We look at really 4 big markers for drug-herb interactions. Cytochrome P450 is one of them. P-glycoprotein is another one. And then the other 2 are going to be protein binding and narrow therapeutic index, which are more on the drug side than the herb side at this point. So there's some evidence of potential drug-herb interactions, but I don't think it's very strong evidence. All right, berberine, a constituent of Huang Lian, was shown to prevent cyclophosphamide-induced cystitis in rats. So cystitis is an inflamed bladder in rats, and cyclophosphamide can induce that. And if you put in berberine, it can prevent it from doing that. That would be what we consider a positive interaction. But again, constituent rats, not relevant to humans in any way, shape, or form. WebMD says Huang Lian may decrease the breakdown of cyclosporine in the body. I did not see a ton of evidence to support that. They probably found a study that said that. Gardner and McGuffin, if you're not familiar with them, this is a book put out by, I think, the American Herbal Producers Association. and looks at the safety of herbs. This is a big book and well researched and I think very solid grounds. And it says this herb is an A interaction class, meaning no clinically relevant interactions are expected. And I would agree with that assessment based on what I've seen on drug-herb interactions. So I wouldn't be super worried about drug-herb interactions. Just when I teach about drug-herb interactions, I do often teach about my advice is when you're doing herbs and drugs together is start low, go slow. So start at low doses of the herbs and slowly build them up to therapeutic levels. That's great advice in general, even when there are no clinically relevant interactions expected. So what are some concerns about this herb? According to Bensky, because of its strong, bitter, and his team, I should say, I shouldn't leave his team out here. So Bensky and his team, because of its strong, bitter, cold, and drying properties, it should be used with caution in those with patterns of cold, yang deficiency, or yin deficiency, especially those with cold from deficiency of the spleen and stomach. So again, these are very sort of technical Chinese approaches to this, but makes a lot of sense from a Chinese point of view. They continue with a translation from Harm and Benefit in the Materia Medica. Strictly forbidden for illness due to cold from deficiency. As a rule, this herb is contraindicated for all of the following conditions: patients with blood and qi deficiency, spleen and stomach weakness, insomnia and fright due to blood deficiency, yet appearing with restless heat and thirst, postpartum insomnia, fever due to blood deficiency, and diarrhea with abdominal pain, pox and sores in children who have diarrhea due to yang deficiency, and insufficiency of true yin leading to internal heat and restless irritability. So all of that was just said is kind of summarized in what I already said, basically. So it just kind of, I think, says it in a little bit more force. So it's an interesting approach to that. So that was a translation. And then they also, from another text called The Rectification of the Meaning of Materia Medica, basically says if the tongue coat is not thick, yellow, and greasy and covers the entire tongue, this herb should not be used wantonly. I like that word, wantonly. So that kind of goes against Huang earlier. We talked about Huang saying it could be thick or thin, yellow and greasy. So, you know, again, if it's thin, yellow, and greasy, don't use it wantonly. I think that's probably fair. Make sure everything is working well. So, this herb does have numerous adverse reactions, including transient diarrhea, abdominal distension, boroborygmus, that's that moving of the stomach. You hear the gurgling of it. That's boroborygmus, things moving. Polyuria, so that's a lot of your excessive urination. Loss of appetite, vomiting, nausea, and epigastric discomfort. So discomfort in sort of the upper abdomen would be that. It and its main constituent berberine can be injected, and that has its own set of reactions that we need to be aware of. Since we can't really inject this in most of the United States, and I think most in the world, except for China and Japan and a few other exceptions. There are some states that do allow injections, but I'm not going to get too much into the injection aspect of this. Brandon Wiseman agrees with these overall concerns and says Huang Lian is very bitter and cold, so excessive doses or prolonged use can easily damage the spleen and stomach. It is contraindicated in spleen stomach vacuity cold, and it should be used with care in yin vacuity with damage to liquid, because this is drying, so you don't want to damage the liquid anymore. And finally, Chen and Chen largely agrees with these concerns and adds that it is relatively safe, but may cause the following adverse effects: allergic reactions and rashes, dizziness, headache, tinnitus, nausea and vomiting, palpitations, shortness of breath, abdominal fullness, diarrhea, and lower red blood cells. And finally, Gardner and McGuffin says it is a safety class 2A herb, and it should not be used during pregnancy. They continue to say that that most of the safety concerns of this herb are based on studies of berberine and other alkaloids and may not apply to the whole herb. So this is one of the reasons why I love Gardner and McGuffin, is because they don't take a study on berberine and then say, well, because berberine is the biggest constituent of Coptis, which it isn't. You know, the biggest constituents are carbohydrates and proteins and all sorts of other things other than berberine. Berberine is a very teeny tiny portion of it, and because berberine is affecting, does all these things, then this herb has to do all those bad things too, and it just isn't true. And so I like that Gardner and McGuffin kind of call that out very specifically here in this regard. All right, well, that is pretty much our whole presentation. Thank you. Timing is really good. I would like to remind you, if you're listening to this podcast, when you buy from Amazon, please use the banner ad on our homepage at spurbsherbs.com. If you did like this podcast, please do us a big, huge favor. Give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app. Really would appreciate it. Thank you. And as always, you can get in touch with me at Dr. Greg at spurbsherbs.com or at our website, www.spurbsherbs.com. And that again is SPERBSHERBS.com, or it's the title of the podcast, Spurbs Herbs. Thank you. And as usual, we have our long geography.
Spurbs Herbs. The proceeding was presented by Dr. Greg Sperber. We would like to thank Janelle for all her support and everybody else who contributed to this program.
Janelle,
Timothy
Thompson,
Dobbins,
Rogers,
Campbell,